Friends, please join with me in prayer. Holy One, we seek your guidance, that from the written word and the spoken word, we can find your true and everlasting word. Hallelujah. Amen. A few weeks ago, I gathered a group of friends. Now, these people didn't know each other, so we were talking about our passions and interests as people were getting to know each other. One of the couples worked extensively with animals. They were not professional trainers, but they had lots of dogs and horses and really worked to train their animals well. A woman in our group started talking about her dog and all its behavior problems. You know, it didn't listen, it barked all the time, it jumped up on people, it exasperated her. What could she do? One of my friends who worked with their animals said, "A dog trainer I know says dogs take on the personality of their owner after a year. So the dog becomes a mirror of you. Do you like what you see?" Well, the woman who had complained about her dog thought for a moment, and then she said, "Well, really, it's my husband's dog." Sometimes we don't like what we see in the mirror, but we need to look, because we not only set the example for our dogs and our pets, but our children and our friends and our community. People watch what we do, and it impacts them. I don't know if Gandhi really said it, but perhaps you've heard the saying, "I like your Christ, but I don't like you Christians. You're so unlike your Christ." What kind of example do our lives offer? Paul spoke of this in his letter to Timothy. He described himself as a man of violence, but through grace, through the love of God, he came to reshape his life. Reflecting back on his life story, Paul said, "I received mercy, so that in me Jesus Christ might make an example of me for those who would come to believe in him." Jesus made an example of Paul. Now, normally we think of being made an example of as something negative, a kind of punishment. But Paul didn't speak of it that way. Being made an example of wasn't a punishment, but becoming a light. It wasn't something bad, but an inspiration. The story of how Paul became an example can help us imagine what we can do in our lives too. Now, as you may recall, Paul stood out in the memory of the early church as a persecutor of Jesus' first followers. When a crowd decided to stone the first deacon, Stephen, Paul was there helping the crowd and encouraging them. And he wasn't just there as a passive bystander, but someone who actively instigated the crowd and its violence. As the Bible remembers of Paul, Paul ravaged the church by entering house after house, pulling out women and men, and throwing them in prison. After hunting down the Christians in Jerusalem, Paul headed out to Damascus in order to catch any Christians who had fled from him and sought sanctuary there. But on the road to Damascus, a strange thing happened. A light, a searing light, knocked him off his horse, and he heard Jesus say to him, "Why do you persecute me?" Paul still went to Damascus, but now he went to learn. A man named Ananias taught Paul about Jesus. What did Ananias see that caused him to reach out to Paul? For certainly, Ananias saw something in Paul which made him take a chance on working with this man of violence. It occurred to me that Ananias looked at Paul the way that Jesus taught him to look at people. We get a sense of how Jesus looked at people in that parable of the lost sheep. The very religious people in the time of Jesus noted that he ate with tax collectors and other people they didn't like. And when they raised an objection to what Jesus did, he told them that familiar parable of the shepherd reaching out, searching out for the lost sheep. "Which one of you," Jesus asked, "having 100 sheep and losing one of them, did not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it?" Jesus told the parable to describe the character of God. God, like a shepherd, rejoices over finding the lost sheep. The behavior of modern-day very religious people makes me notice a particular element of the story. Notice, the shepherd didn't judge the sheep for getting lost. The shepherd didn't say, "What a worthless sheep." And when the shepherd found the sheep, he didn't make it miserable with shame and guilt. What would it be like if we talked about feeling lost and even sin without resorting to that language of judgment and blame and guilt and shame? The shepherd searched out for the lost sheep, searching out for what was missing and then rejoicing when it was found. I think Ananias knew this about God, knew God would search for what was lost. And so when he met Paul, he searched the wilderness of Paul's heart for the goodness lost inside of him. Ananias knew he could find it, and so he sat with Paul, sat with a violent man, listening for the humanity inside of him, looking for the divine light so deep inside of him. Ananias followed the example of Jesus. He sought what was lost inside of Paul and rejoiced when he found it. Through the work of Ananias, Paul turned from violence to become a follower of Jesus. Ananias lived as an example of Jesus to Paul, and that example impacted Paul's life, reshaped it completely. There are many things in Paul's writings that I disagree with, but I know that Paul tried to be an example of Jesus to those he met. Paul searched out the lost and the lonely and the least in his world. Today's reading came from Paul's letter to Timothy. Timothy, the son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father. Timothy, a person lost in between the ethnic conflicts of his day, lost between Jews and Greeks, a man welcome in neither community. It was Good Shepherd work when Paul reached out to him. Work like that of Ananias. Work that involved searching for the goodness that others didn't see. In his own life and in his own way, Paul became an example of Jesus. Can we be examples of Jesus like Ananias and Paul? In our own lives, can we be examples of God searching for the goodness lost and hidden in the world? This week, Bill Henry installed sculpture throughout the Commons. I hope you'll spend some time after worship taking in his work. One of those pieces really resonates with me, the cosmic light. It stands atop our main stairs, two curving columns and an ethereal blue light shining between them. The light reflects back and forth between the silver columns so that it almost seems to have a substance and solidity all its own. The columns both hide and reveal the light, and so what you see of the light changes as you move around the sculpture. The sculpture seems to symbolize our humanity, an interior light peeking out from a hard exterior. Can we see the cosmic light of other people? Could we be like the shepherd, searching for that light in someone lost in a wilderness of trouble or rejection? One person who lives as an example of Jesus is Antoinette Tuff. You might recall her story from mid-August. She was the school bookkeeper who faced down an armed gunman who came into our elementary school. Michael Hill, the gunman, entered the elementary school outside of Atlanta armed with an AK-47, 500 bullets, and no reason to live. Once inside the school, he headed for the office where he took Antoinette Tuff hostage and demanded that she call the television stations because he wanted his story seen by the world. Tuff could see how Hill had lost sight of anything good inside of himself. Perhaps she even intuitively sensed that Hill was not taking his medication for psychosis, medication he stopped taking because his Medicare coverage ran out. Inspired by the example of Jesus, she searched the wilderness inside of Hill. Parents gathered at a Walmart parking lot near the school, and so they heard an exchange of gunfire between Hill and the police. As terrifying as that must have been, something even more dramatic was happening inside between Tuff and Hill. Antoinette Tuff, held hostage by an angry and hopeless man, began to talk to him about her own life, her divorce, her disabled son, her own hopelessness. She spoke reassuringly to him, saying, "I love you. I'm proud of you. We all go through something in this life. You're going to be okay, sweetheart. I tried to commit suicide last year after my husband left me. Antoinette Tuft used her own life as an example of moving ahead despite all the trouble in her life. Her example and the compassion with which she shared it found the goodness inside of troubled Michael Hill. When the police entered the building, they found Antoinette Tuft had talked Hill into lying down, laying with his hands behind his back. How differently this story ended than so many other tragedies we know, because Tuft kept searching for that cosmic light in Hill, a light he didn't even know could be found in his wilderness. Tuft's example becomes all the more powerful when one considers our culture of bravado and fear. After the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, the head of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, declared, "The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun." For all his bravado, LaPierre could not have done better than Antoinette Tuft, armed only with the power of her example. Or remember the defense of George Zimmerman, fear. He said he was so afraid of Trayvon Martin that killing him seemed the only option. A jury of his peers acquitted him. Antoinette Tuft felt fear, but she also remembered Jesus and tried to be an example of him to Michael Hill. Discipleship at its best means living as an example of Jesus so that people can see Jesus in our lives. And that comes when we live like Ananias and Paul and Antoinette, live with eyes open to the light in other people. But perhaps it seems too monumental to do what Antoinette Tuft did. I really can't imagine having the composure to live like she did, to be as heroic as she was. It can make us wonder if we could ever do anything similar. The country and rock legend Johnny Cash once sang a song called "Half a Mile a Day." In the song, he described entering a church in the midst of a revival. The congregation called out to the preacher, shouting out in just amazing exclamations of their own salvation, saying they were running to Jesus and flying up to heaven. And then an older woman stood up, and she said, "I'm coming, Lord, for my heavenly reward. I'm on my way to you. Can you see me coming through clouds of persecution and stumbling on the way? But I expect I'm making about half a mile a day." Johnny Cash's song reminds me that it doesn't matter how dramatically we live. Few of us will ever do something as heroic as Antoinette Tuft, but we can all be examples of Jesus in our own ways, making about half a mile a day. This Sunday, the Board of Outreach and Mission celebrates all the many ways people volunteer in our congregation, from tutoring in Milwaukee public schools to feeding hungry youth at Pathfinders, to serving and helping Burmese immigrants, to advocating for justice, from serving on boards in the church to taking on all of the nitty-gritty tasks that go on in the life of our community. Your volunteer work turns your life into an example of Jesus, a demonstration of God's care and compassion and love. Sometimes your volunteer work means seeing the cosmic light in a child struggling to read, or seeing it in a youth who's acting up. Sometimes it means helping a friend rediscover that light inside of themselves, or singing in the choir so we can all see a sense of the beauty of the human voice. All of this work makes a difference. It creates a community where people can see the love of Jesus manifested in everyday lives, and where even someone could say, I like your Jesus, and I like him because I see it in your life. Hallelujah and amen.